Welcome back to the show. I'm Natalie Brunel. Joining me this week is retired Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, one of my most popular and most requested guests. It's great to see you, Colonel. Thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, sure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I want to start with the big picture. When you look out at the American and geopolitical landscape, what keeps you up at night? What are you most concerned about given everything that's happening right now?
Well, fortunately, I sleep well come hell or high water, so not too much keeps me up. But I think there are a number of things. You mentioned the economy, for instance. I see a lot of evidence that inflation continues to rise. It is not falling. So I don't think the Fed has, quote unquote, won the battle with inflation. I continue to be concerned about the U.S. Treasury market. The Chinese are selling their treasuries, the long-term treasuries. I think we're going to see more of that from Japan, probably India, as well as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So my outlook on the economy is kind of grim. I continue to worry about a financial crisis that could then drive us into something much worse than just a recession potentially. To that, you have to add this massive influx of people, more than 9 million since President Biden took office. And that probably has us up somewhere around 30 plus million or more illegals. My last discussions privately with people at the Department of Homeland Security who are all deeply depressed and demoralized by Mayorkas tell me that it's at least 30 million now. This is an enormous problem for us, especially when you anticipate financial economic downturns. You suddenly have millions of people that you can't employ. They're not citizens, they're foreigners. You want to be able to employ your own citizens. I'm sure you've heard this comment over and over and over again. Oh, well, these are jobs Americans won't perform. Well, what we found out in 1929 in the aftermath of the stock market crash, and as the economy began to tank, that Americans would suddenly do all of those jobs because they needed jobs. And so we deported 9 million Mexicans who were inside the United States illegally. And after that happened, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this was done under Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt deported another 3+ million. Then you had another 2 million roughly under Harry Truman and 1.5 under Eisenhower, all for the same kinds of reasons. We have to open up jobs that Americans can perform. In some cases, though, we do have advances in technology that make some of these jobs redundant in any case. That's another issue. Obviously, these people coming in are not showing up with degrees in applied mathematics, physics, engineering, chemistry, or anything else. So that I think is hugely problematic. And then, of course, you have this ugly divide in the country, which begins to look more and more rural versus urban, because the urban centers, the big urban centers, are hardcore fortresses for the so-called left. And outside of the fortresses, you have America. People that are not changing their identities, their culture, their language, their thinking. And they're not very happy with what's happening in Washington. So those things I think I really believe those are at the top of the list. And we haven't even talked about the rising criminality and the failure to enforce the law. So then if you look overseas, Ukraine is a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed in this war pointlessly. They're still dying. They're not dying as rapidly as they have before, but they're dying, largely because the Russians, though they are advancing across the front, they're deliberately moving slowly and offering people the opportunity to surrender because they don't want to kill them. This is something I don't think Americans have ever understood. That in eastern Ukraine, the Russians have taken a position that these really are people like us. We really don't want to kill them. They're more Orthodox Christians and they're Slavs, so why kill them? That's going to come to an end at some point, but it's going to be a slow and ponderous end. The question is what comes afterwards. And we insist on propping up this facade of a legitimate government. It's illegitimate. It's not even a government anymore. It's a massive kleptocracy. Somebody contacted me the other day and said, what about this 61 billion that we're about to transfer to Ukraine? And I said, well, I wouldn't be too concerned because most of that will stay here. It'll just be laundered through the congressional machine, end up in the defense industry and all the donors who profit from this, along with many constituents who want to stay operating naturally on these assembly lines, will be happy. The bad news for the Ukrainians is that most of this equipment will not arrive for at least a year, by which time I suspect this will all be passe. Again, people don't understand this. And then, of course, we're employing the Ukrainian army. We pay for it. We're paying for the Ukrainian government. And I suspect Mr. Zelensky and his cohorts will buy additional mansions with whatever they can steal from what's coming in. So that's the Ukraine mess. But it drags on, and it will drag on, I think, until the Europeans, particularly if you look at Poland right now with this new government under Tusk, really makes no sense. It's an EU transplant. I don't think it's something the Poles want, so I don't think it'll last very long. Because I think if I look at the polls in Poland, and I'm talking about the polling data, by the way, it suggests that they've had enough of this and they want to get away from this Ukrainian war and they want to march in a different direction, much like the Hungarians. So I think, the Europeans are trying to dig themselves out from under, the last several years of what I would call globalist neocon domination. Germany, of course, is the principal basket case. It's dying economically. It's being deindustrialized by its own government when there are alternatives. And the question is, how long do the Germans wait before they finally wake up and say, this has got to stop? It's anybody's guess. But, the Germans do have a bad habit historically of sticking with bad governments long past the point when it made sense to do so. So I guess that's going to continue. And then if you look at the Middle East is a very strange animal because we tend to see everything through the Israeli lens because we, quote unquote, support Israel. I've always supported Israel and I think it has every right to exist. But I don't think it's wise for the Israelis to wage a campaign of expulsion and murder in Gaza. I think that's been a catastrophe. It's also spreading now on a smaller level to the West Bank. And as King Abdullah of Jordan said recently to President Biden, 100,000 people have either been killed, wounded, gone missing, and most of them are women and children. And this is not stopping. This is continuing. So if you step away from that, look at the rest of the region, there's something that's very clear. The Muslim Arabs and Turks are absolutely enraged over what's happening in Gaza. They want action. Their governments do not. Their governments are afraid of action. And this is an interesting point of view that I don't think most Americans understand. There are 100 million Egyptians. They're probably living on infrastructure that was originally designed for 30 or 40 million. So Egypt's position is fragile. Now, they're much stronger and better off than they were 50 years ago. 50 years ago, I think the literacy rate was in the 40s. Today, it's in the high 80s. They have far more competent and capable people that are technologically savvy that can do things. But still, if you're the president of Israel, this is a fragile society. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, was just in Egypt and held talks for the first time in 13 years because, remember, the president of Egypt is someone that we helped come to power along with the Israelis. He's in a difficult position because there are many in his country who are not happy with that fact. And they begin to suspect him because he's not taking action to help or support the people in Gaza. Well, I think he's unwilling to do something on his own. He and President Erdogan sorted out some questions of oil and natural gas offshore in the Mediterranean from Egypt and Libya. But I also think they discussed Gaza and what if. And it was Mr. Erdogan who spoke very frankly about Gaza after his meeting with General Sisi. General Sisi stood and listened, but did not really address Gaza publicly. That says volumes. And I think there was a discussion of, if I get into a fight with the Israelis, will I have your support? Now, I don't know what Mr. Erdogan said, but I suspect Mr. Erdogan said, if you're attacked, we will do everything we can to help you. Now, what does that mean? I don't know, but he sits on top of the largest military establishment in the region. The Turks are ferocious fighters. Let there be no doubt about it. They could do real damage, and I think the Israelis know that. But I don't think the Israelis believe anything will happen. I think they look at Jordan, which is another country that's somewhat fragile because they have millions of Palestinians in it. Then they look at the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, said, these people can't do anything. We can act as we see fit. And I think people in Washington are saying, go ahead, do whatever you think. We'll do everything we can to help you. And no one is going to challenge us. We haven't mentioned Hezbollah, the other Shiite militias. We haven't mentioned Iran. The Iranians don't want a war, but if they're pushed, yes, they'll fight. And they have substantial military capability that could do a lot of damage. Remember, Israel's a small country. It's not very large. How many missiles can you fire at Israel and not hit something that's important and do serious damage? So nobody knows what will happen, but I think this is somebody said, well, are we in a in a World War I situation? No, I don't think so, but we are in one sense. Everyone who's followed World War I knows 28 June 1914, Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. And then by the end of July, 30 July, 31 July, the French are mobilizing. Then the Russians mobilize, the Austrians mobilize. Finally, the Germans come in, and then the British. They were on a hair trigger, if you will. Everybody was armed to the teeth. They were part of alliance systems, so something was coming. Whether it happened because of the assassination or something else, there's probably going to be some sort of collision. This time around, those regional relationships, like the one between Egypt and Turkey that is now being repaired and being firmed up, those things are changing across the region in ways that should give us and our friends in Israel serious pause. And I think by April and May timeframe, we should have a regional alliance and a readiness across the Muslim world to act against Israel and potentially us. And we finally, I don't know why Americans aren't aware of this. They should be. This is not 1991. We don't have the forces we had in 91. We are not in a good position to wage regional war against anyone. This was always the concern that we had with what happened in Ukraine, that if we got involved with it, we're not prepared for it. We don't have the factories, the manufacturing capability, the scientific industrial turnout that we did years ago. So we're not ready for a major regional war. So those are you asked what keeps me up. I still sleep, but these are the things that I think we should be concerned about right now. And they're not the only ones. There's trouble elsewhere in Armenia and the Caucasus. There's, things happening in Southeast Asia. There's things happening down in Latin America. But the things we just covered, they can have a real impact on us. What happens in the Middle East will not stay in the Middle East. It will find its way here to the United States. And all of our forces over there will be at high risk.
Coin Stories is brought to you by Bitdeer, where the power of Bitcoin mining is at your fingertips. As a publicly traded leader, Bitdeer's global reach and scale means they're everywhere you need them to be, ensuring you're part of the thriving Bitcoin economy. Bitdeer's not just mining, they are industry pioneers, and Bitdeer stands alone as the only vertically integrated, technology-focused Bitcoin mining company. What does that mean? Well, they're not just deploying, but developing the latest tech to make Bitcoin mining more efficient and effective. With the industry's most experienced leadership team, innovation is in their DNA, and it shows, with a quarter of their workforce dedicated to research and development, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in Bitcoin mining. And now they're leveraging years of expertise in data center and cloud management into high-performance computing through a recently announced partnership with NVIDIA. Join Bitdeer in reshaping the world of Bitcoin mining. Learn more at bitdeer.com and explore how they are pioneering the future today. Right. And when you talk about World War I, people thought that would be over very quickly. It first happened over a bank holiday, and look what it turned into. And there was also obviously the Second World War after it. When you talk about every nation, I almost think of chess pieces on a board and the tensions rising. And to your earlier point about the border migrant crisis, it seems like a lot of people are angry that we're concerned about paying for other countries to defend their borders rather than our own. And political leaders here just seem intent on keeping us intertwined with these foreign conflicts. People are still wanting to continue this war in Ukraine. That seems to be coming more from the left. On the right, I've heard media outlets and politicians calling for war with Iran. So why these forever wars as opposed to diplomacy?
Natalie, you've been to Washington, so you know that the people in Washington live in a bubble. They don't live in the same world with the rest of us in the United States. Let's get that through everybody's head. They really don't. They think that this $34 trillion national sovereign debt is irrelevant. I mean, occasionally you'll have someone like Senator Rand Paul or Mike Lee of Utah stand up and say, this can't go on forever. And they're right. Nothing can go on forever. This is not going to go on forever. We just don't know when it's all going to fall apart. I'm there with Nassim Taleb and James Ricard. So at some point, this all implodes. And I don't think we're ready for that because I don't think the people in Washington really believe that could happen. So that's a huge problem from the purely financial economic standpoint. Secondly, Washington is occupied territory. It's occupied by donors, big donors. Some of these people are what we would call in Eastern Europe oligarchs, billionaire oligarchs. Others are corporate in nature. But the point is they own Washington, D.C. There are very few people there who can hold on to their seats and stay there for any length of time unless they take in money from corporate and oligarchic donors. They know that if they don't take the money and they say, I'm going to do what I think is right, that the money will go to their future opponents and they will lose their seats. So people rationalize away the criticality of doing what's right for the country and what's right for Americans in favor of doing what they have to get the donor money. That's not going to change anytime soon. The donors own the candidates. The candidates that we have running for president right now all face the same dilemma. How truthful can you be? How forthright can you be about what you will do if you're elected? You can't, because if you are too forthright and too honest, you risk losing donor support because the donors have agendas. Sometimes it's energy related. Sometimes it's climate change. There are a whole range of big issues. So that's the biggest single problem, I think, right now that Americans don't get. So they say, wait a minute now, $61 billion for Ukraine, 14 plus billion for Israel, 7 billion for Taiwan, and 0 for the border. Now, how do you explain this? Well, the border doesn't pay them. It doesn't pay them. There is no incentive in Washington for anybody to do much about the border because the money is elsewhere. Or the money is against closing the border. I mean, you can look at people like the Koch brothers and others. They made it very clear, leave the borders open. They think they're getting cheap labor. But we know the truth. What the truth is, this is diluting our country. When I say dilute, it's diluting our national identity, national culture. The things that we value as Americans. Our very identity is being diluted. That's not accidental because the swamp wants that to happen. I think the globalist neocon swamp simply wants to transform us into sedated consumers. And they're planning on keeping the money going come hell or high water so that we'll all sit and take our checks and do nothing. The possibility of the checks stop, that's scary for everybody in Washington. So they'll keep the basic checks, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the 2,000 sort of redistribution programs that support this complex, that move money into the pockets of people, pensions, all these kinds of things, because they know when the people in Paris in 1789 could not afford to buy bread, there was a revolution. So they understand that much. But otherwise, they could care less about the rest of it. And this is catastrophic for the country, in my judgment. But, we hold the minority opinion right now. We're not in power.
Well, what if we couldn't just print money and keep going to war? We had to tax the public. Would that fix anything? Because I know that one thing that you've talked about is the fact that the dollar's under threat right now. I mean, the fact that we keep going into debt and we've weaponized the dollar with sanctions. Other countries are looking for alternatives, right? So how much longer can we actually print? And if we couldn't print anymore, would that help us or hurt us?
Well, that depends on whom you speak with. How much longer can this go on? I've had people say, well, we've got another year of money printing. I've heard other people say, no, we've got 5 or 10 years. I don't have an immediate answer. I'm surprised that it continues at this stage. But remember, the new financial system, which is beginning to develop overseas, in other words, the alternative to SWIFT and other things, the alternative to America's financial hegemony, which is really what we're talking about. Those things are just starting. Now, people look at BRICS, and of course, one of my favorite people is Alasdair Macleod, because he's one of the few people that recognizes that while we have been trying to do all the damage we can to Russia, that very skillfully, Mr. Putin has been waging financial war against the West. And the entire BRICS concept, which leads you to gold-backed currency, is designed to get everybody who wants to get out from under us out. And right now, that's a lot of people. We still have 32 countries under sanctions of various types and kinds. And everybody has learned that if you don't do what the United States wants you to do, regardless of whatever it is, you're going to be bullied, you're going to be sanctioned, then eventually you're going to be bombed. So everybody has said, well, how do we get out from under this? Well, the first step, the quickest one, the most important one, is the financial solution, to get out from under our financial solution. But that's going to take time. It's going to take time for new institutions to emerge. And then it's not 100% that everybody wants to get away from us. They just want to get out from under us. They still want to do business with us. This is the thing Americans don't understand. They don't like our government, but they still would like to do business with America. There are good reasons to do business with us. That's even true for Russia. That's true for China. So it's, you've asked a critical question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. Ben Stein says it goes on until it can't, and then it stops. I think Ben Stein is right. We just don't know when that will happen. But I think we're getting closer.
Well, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that we're killing the dollar with our own hands in the interview that he did with Tucker Carlson. I really wanted to get your reaction to that interview. It was not what I was expecting, especially the beginning part where he launched into ninth century Russian history. What did you think about what he said, maybe specifically about some of the economic issues we're facing?
I'm waiting for him to announce that he's going to start using Bitcoin as currency.
Do you think that's possible?
I'm one of these people that thinks if you look at Bitcoin right now, everybody's excited. It's up to over 50,000. I'm one of these people that thinks if you invest 100,000 in it, eventually it's going to be worth $1 million because the fiat currency is not going to work. And no one is really enthused about the bank issuing digital currency. I mean, you might as well stick with fiat currency. You still have no control over your own destiny. So the only way to get control of your own destiny right now in the West is Bitcoin, unless you want to go to gold-backed currency. But then the question is, how much gold have we really got? I loved it when Ron Paul years ago said, please, I want to go into Fort Knox. I want to inventory, find out what's there. Well, it's not just Fort Knox. It's what's under the streets of New York City. We know that J.P. Morgan built a tunnel right underneath to the Fed and the banks in New York City. Where is it? The Germans said they wanted all of their gold back. They got about 40% of what we're holding, and then we stopped. So the question is, what have we really got? Nobody bothers to ask that question. Of course, when you ask Bernanke, he says, well, gold really has no value anymore. We just keep it because it's traditional. Right. That someone with his intelligence and background and station in this country would say such a stupid thing leads me to believe that he was lying because he's not a dumb man. And I think we have a lot of that going on in Washington. A lot of it's going on in Wall Street. And I think eventually it's going to fall apart. So to answer your question, economically, I think we are a runaway locomotive on a very wobbly track headed down the side of a mountain. And at the bottom of the mountain is a ravine. And can we put the brakes on, or is it too late? I'm beginning to think it's probably too late. So the question is, when we get down there, do we just go right over the cliff into the ravine, or do we stop magically or miraculously? I think if you read Alasdair MacLean and what he says about BRICS and what he says about the Russians and others, we're headed into the ravine.
Well, I really don't think it's too late. I'm looking at this positively, and I'm glad you brought up Bitcoin because for the first time, we have this neutral global asset and a network impervious to attack. And I'm curious your thoughts on why more political leaders around the world, but especially here in the United States, aren't getting it and aren't talking about it. Is it just because they can't control it?
It's because you are governed by a gerontocracy. If you look at people in my generation, oh, that's ridiculous. Bitcoin is nonsense. Forget it. Nobody bothers to look at it. Nobody bothers to try and
Right.
understand it. Alistair McLeod's in the same group. And he says gold, 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 which is fine, but he just ignores Bitcoin for all the same reason. Oh, well, that's just like fiat currency. No, it isn't. We know that's not true. We know there's a limited amount of it, just as you have a limited amount of gold. We know that you can't get access to it and steal it. We know that it holds value. Eventually, I think we in the West will have to go to Bitcoin because we can't go to the gold-backed solution. If we try to do that, we'll simply fail. I don't think we have enough gold to do it. So what do? If your fiat currency is no longer worth anything, and I think we're on that road, what do? Bitcoin. Now, if it weren't valuable, look, Natalie, if it weren't valuable and we couldn't go to it, why would the banks want to issue their own digital currency? But remember, everybody my age, if you're over 50, the attitude is forget it, it's nonsense. And that's true for a lot of different things.
Do you also think that there are strategic national security implications of adopting Bitcoin? I mean, again, being this network that cannot be hacked, and in a future of potentially cyber warfare, shouldn't the United States embrace a network that is so powerful? And we could lead. I mean, we lead in Bitcoin mining right now, but it seems like we're sometimes attacking what could help strengthen us.
Well, you have to keep in mind the principal purpose right now of government in the West and governments in general, but particularly today ours. It's control. Why would you adopt something that you do not control? Now, what did we do before we had a Federal Reserve? We resisted the national bank for years. We fought against it. We did have crises of various types and kinds. The government did not intervene in those crises. Everyone did not starve to death. Some people went broke, others got rich, and we continued to develop and grow as a nation and as an economy. The first time the government intervened in a crisis was 1929. And up until that point, where there had been no outside intervention. But the intervention came as a result of the Federal Reserve. Intervention means control. Control means that you are hostage to the government. More precisely, the international finance system, which is a banking cartel. Everything is mortgaged to that. Nobody wants that to stop who has money. You have to understand that. So control's the issue, but they're going to lose control. This is the point that we keep talking about. When you listen to even Rubini will say this, everybody eventually comes around to saying, well, it's about control. And you hear people say, well, don't fight the Fed. The Fed's in control. Well, I don't think the Fed's quite in the same position of control that it once was. And I think it's going to lose control. And then the effort will be to get it back. But what if you can't get it back? Then you have to go to an alternative. And that is Bitcoin, in my judgment. So it's going to happen, I think, eventually.
Well, control is very top down, and that's a lot of people's concern right now, right? We've had so much concentration of power, and we seem to be moving further toward authoritarianism on the left or the right. But Bitcoin presents this alternative that has really been grassroots. It's very bottom up. Do you really think that can win against the powers at the top who hold all the money and it seems like all the cards?
That's a good question, and I don't have an easy answer. It depends on circumstances and what people know and what they're willing to do. That is the ultimate PhD dissertation question that you've just raised. And I don't have an easy answer. I think they'll lose control, and I think it'll be a default issue. Lots of people with money and lots of people without much money are all going to turn to Bitcoin because that will be the only thing that's left that stores value. Now, that doesn't mean gold will become worthless by any stretch of the imagination. Gold will always be with us. So will silver, platinum, and other rare minerals and metals and so forth. But it's easier to do business in Bitcoin than it is to do business in gold. I think we know that. And it's the only real viable alternative at this point to fiat currency. And if you don't trust the banks, and I think a lot of people are having trouble trusting the government right now, then that's where you go. I mean, when are we going to see something worse happen in the banking system? I mean, we've had the Silicon Valley thing. There are other banks that are on the verge of getting into
Right.
trouble. The banking system is not solid. So where do you put your money at that point? Do you run out and try to buy gold?
Mhm.
Uh, I'm not sure. I think Bitcoin will then become even more desirable and attractive than it's ever been in the past. It may be something that the government can't stop and then will be compelled to live with, which would be fine with me. I'd love it that
Well,
way.
you bring up really fascinating points because we are seeing a consolidation of the smaller banks to these too big to fail that have already, kicked the can up to the sovereign level, and taxpayers have to bail out all the risk takers in the elites and the Washington insiders. It's time for another quick break to hear these messages from my partners. Next up, Bitcoin 2024, the world's largest Bitcoin conference, is coming to Nashville this year. Come join us for 3 amazing days of keynotes, panels, networking events, and my Women of Bitcoin brunch. The Bitcoin conference is where I launched my podcast almost 3 years ago. You never know what can happen or who you can meet here. Head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL, HODL, for 10% off. Next up, Coinkite, which makes everything you need to safely self-custody your Bitcoin, including the Coldcard Wallet. This is the cold storage device I use for safekeeping my Bitcoin. You can verify the source code, it's ultra secure, and it's easy to use even if you're a beginner. Head to their site in my show notes and get a 5% discount with promo code COINSTORIES. Next up, CrowdHealth. Health insurance costs are sky high, and it's money that feels wasted if you don't need a doctor. By crowdfunding healthcare with other Bitcoiners, I get to avoid traditional insurance fees and support real people instead of mega corporations. CrowdHealth also works to reduce your medical bills, so the community's contributions cover more. Imagine spending just $100 a month on healthcare and investing the rest in Bitcoin. If you're interested, visit joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie. All right, back to the show. It's also interesting to think about what has happened because of all the government intervention. I mean, you talked about 1929. Not a lot of people talk about the recession that happened in 1920 to 21. And Warren Harding was probably the last president who said, you know what, no, we're not. We're going to step out of the way and just let the economy regulate itself. And the recession was like a blip. I mean, all of a sudden we were chugging along again. But because of all the intervention and all the central bank manipulation of the economy after 1929, we exacerbated, I think, the Great Depression. And then we've only seen these cycles of up and down and up and down. And each crisis seems to be worse, but then they just, taper over it and they fill the little leaks with bubble gum. And all of a sudden we have this massive sovereign debt bubble. And when that pops, it could truly be hyperinflation in a way that none of us probably imagined possible in the great superpower that was the United States. And so how do we get that message out to the public that we really need a shift? You can't keep voting in for more intervention and more stimulus and more handout checks, because that's the very thing that's going to crush us.
Well, you're talking about the mother of all bubbles. And first of all, you've got to persuade people to believe that's even possible. And my experience in Washington and around here is that, no, they refuse to believe it. Leon Trotsky, not one of my favorite people. I think he and his comrades, the Bolsheviks, should have been rounded up and shot in the interests of humanity, and we'd have saved tens of millions of lives. But he was right about a few things. And in 1920, when people were telling him what they wanted to do in the Soviet Union was impossible, he looked at them and he said, look, the revolution was always impossible until it happened. That's what you're dealing with right now. The same mentality. Oh, that's impossible. That's impossible. It's not impossible. And then it happens. So I don't think you're going to get very far in the short run convincing anybody of anything until it happens. I think you've got probably support for that viewpoint from perhaps a third of the electorate. And remember that viewpoint is not at all supported at the top. And if you go on the mainstream media, go to the various cable stations and listen to them talk about the economy, you'd think that we're on the path to blue skies.
Yeah.
Not only will there be no recession, whatever happens, it's a soft landing. Everything is just fine. Then you and I earlier in this conversation discussed all the various things happening beyond America's borders, along with the catastrophe on the Mexican border and the proliferation of these illegals inside the country, the collapse of the rule of law, which has really happened in the United States. because the chief law enforcement officer of the country is President Biden. And he's not enforcing federal law. He's suspending it or violating it. When you look at those things, how will those events, depending upon what happens over the next 6 to 12 months, impact the economy, impact the financial system, change the lives of Americans? That's why when people start painting this glamorous picture of a soft landing and it's, good time, happy times are here again, I sort of sit there and said, how can you possibly reach that conclusion?
Right. Well, and that's the whole movement towards you will own nothing and you will be happy. It's crazy to think about because this country was founded by revolutionaries who fought, rugged individuals who fought for our freedom. And here we are today. Sometimes I wonder, I mean, the facts are out there. Everybody knows it, they're barely keeping up with the cost of living. The majority of Americans don't have enough for a $400 emergency. Assets are owned by the 1%. The majority of people can't save for retirement or pay for their kids' education. But we're not seeing people out in the streets, protesting and saying we want something different, we want something better. People seem very complacent. Do you agree?
Yes, but I think it's back to what I said earlier. As long as the food stamps are available, as long as the government checks continue to show up, and remember, what is it? A third or more of our gross domestic product or gross national product is now government spending. I mean, who are we kidding? So, I mean, as long as these things continue, not much will happen. It's back to the old adage, France was in trouble. The French economy was in trouble for years. You've heard of this man, John Law, under Louis XV, who concocted this tremendous scandal about gold, set up phony convoys coming into Paris that they circulated the rumor these were all carrying gold to the treasury. It was a big lie. But you didn't get a revolution until 1789. Some people would look at that and say, well, why wasn't there a revolution in 1715 or 1730 or 1740? First, you had to go through the assistance from France to us for our revolution. And by the way, without French assistance, there would be no United States of America today. We stopped kidding ourselves. We never had more than about 13% of the American population behind the so-called revolution. My family was here then. We were loyal to the crown to the bitter end. We only became citizens when we were told, if you don't become citizens, you are going to be deported and we are going to confiscate your property. That's what it came down to. So without the French, forget it. You wouldn't have a country today. But that also bankrupted France. He had no money to spend, yet he went on and did it. Then you had a weak government, somebody that should have acted in a number of important ways, this Louis XVI, but he never did. In a lot of ways, President Biden's government is weak. Oh, it acts from time to time, but we know what it acts against. The sort of ghost of white supremacy or white Christian nationalism or something. And everybody that I know all says, well, where are all these people? Could we fill an auditorium with them? Probably not. So it's all nonsense, but that's the focus. In the meantime, the country's overrun. The rule of law is breaking down. The economy's a mess. Nothing's happening. So I think we just now need to do what makes sense for ourselves. And I tell people, get out of these overpriced stocks. If there's anything out there worth having, I think they're commodities. As my grandfather used to say, Douglas, if it comes out of the ground, buy it. Everyone will eventually need it. Oil, gold, silver, agricultural products, okay? But, as a general rule, we're a mess right now. Everything's overvalued. It's not going to last. So get into Bitcoin, get into gold, be in cash. That's why I cite James Ricard's and Nassim Taleb. Every time they bring him on to talk, you can watch Nassim and how disgusted he gets when people ask him dumb questions on MSNBC or something else. And they say, well, you say this is this and this is this. And he said, Armageddon is over the horizon. It's there. Well, why do you feel this way? And he sort of rolls his eyes. I mean, this is the guy that has been talking about the disaster, all the black swans ready to take off at a moment's notice forever. They're coming. They will take off. There's no doubt about it. And when I say forever, that's misleading. Certainly for the last 10 years, maybe 15. I mean, everybody's seeing what's going on. You've described it perfectly. I've listened to you describe the disaster over and over and over again. But until it happens, it can't. And that's why I quoted Trotsky.
It has been fascinating to see, the stock market at all-time highs with these higher rates, so much underlying weakness in the economy. But I think there's this general understanding that, hey, if something happens, the Fed will just come in and print. So let's keep going higher. And to your earlier point about Biden, so many people question, like, who's actually running our government right now? And we see this election coming up. I actually think it's a perfect symbol that we have two folks who are, past retirement age that are going to be leading the country potentially again, because it is, again, a symbol of the decline of our empire. We're sort of in the geriatric phase, I think, of our American greatness. But let's talk about the election for a second, because who's going to be on this ticket? I mean, is it going to be Biden versus Trump? I can't picture Biden on that ticket, yet all the outlets, they deny that it's going to be Newsom and Obama. So what do you think?
Well, I wouldn't believe anything the mainstream media says. I've stopped listening to them. I haven't paid any attention to them for years. I mean, they told everybody, Russia's weak. Russia's armed forces are incapable. The Russian people hate Putin. Once we sanction Russia and the Ukrainians defeat them, Putin will be removed from office. Well, keep smoking whatever it is. I'm sure it's enjoyable, but it has no chance of ever happening. And that's where we are, I think, on the economic side. It's the same sort of wishful thinking from the same people who are in the mainstream media, in the government, in finance. They're all the same. I think your point is valid. I worry that we are at the end of the republic. And there's a woman, and I feel terrible about this because she's brilliant. She wrote a book. I think she's out of Stanford University, at least Stanford University Press printed it, in which she talks about the end of the republic and says that we need a fundamentally new governmental structure. Right now the 50 state structure doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. It's no way to run the railroad. And as you point out, all the power is being increasingly concentrated to the point where governors are largely irrelevant anyway. We need to restructure, rethink how we govern. But that's not going to happen until things fall apart. No one will do it. But when it does, people that we've never heard of or heard from in the past will emerge, and they'll be younger. I mean, had anybody in 1789 ever heard of Napoleon Bonaparte? No. Or for that matter, his marshals. No one had heard of any of these people. And suddenly they burst onto the scene. And by 1795, 96, 97, the world was changing radically within a few years of the initial revolution. Now, I don't know if we'll have a French-like revolution or a Cromwellian revolution, but we're going to have some sort of revolutionary change in the United States. I think that's coming. Even the astrologers agree with me. And you got to remember what Goldbraith said. Economic forecasting exists to make astrology look professional.
I love the saying that hard times create strong men. And I hope that we do have people emerge who represent the values that helped create this country so that it's not the end of the republic and it's maybe a new beginning surrounded by phenomenal technologies, including Bitcoin, that can really help us prosper. And I don't think that we're going to have a Bitcoiner in the White House this next go around, even though we had some candidates, including RFK Jr., who's pro Bitcoin, and Vivek Ramaswamy was for Bitcoin. Now he's endorsing Trump. Same with DeSantis. But why do you think Biden and Trump both? I mean, do they know about it and they're just speaking against it? Or why do you think they're not really looking into Bitcoin? Trump has at least spoken out against CBDCs.
I don't know. I think, again, you're dealing with people that see a country that is very different from what really exists today.
Well, they're looking backwards.
Yeah, that's the whole point. I mean, I've come to terms with the reality that the institutions I knew in the military, the service academies, these places are all radically different from anything I was exposed to. The people coming out don't have the same values and attitudes whatsoever. So, I think the bottom line is that assuming we go forward and have the election. I mean, there's a lot of water under the bridge between now and November, so we'll see what happens. But if we do, how meaningful will it be? Because if people go in there with the idea that they can somehow or another make the old system work without fundamental change, they're going to fail. So, the first thing that you have trouble getting people to understand, this may sound strange, the last thing this country needs right now is a war with anybody. It makes about as much, the Israelis are lambasting the Gazan Arabs on the basis they say what happened on 7 October. We know this is much larger than that. We lost 112,000 Americans to fentanyl poisoning last year.
Where's
should we bomb Mexico? No, that's not going to help us. You want to kill large numbers of Mexicans because of organized criminality and criminal syndicates that are bringing this in? No, shut the border down. Shut it down. Put 70, 80,000 troops down there. Build the right barriers. Change the way you do business. And it's not just the southern border. We need to secure all of our borders. And we have the technology. We have the surveillance capabilities. We can do all of these things. But we're not going to do anything until things collapse. That's where we're headed. Until it falls apart, no one will act.
And nothing can be rebuilt. Sometimes I think that the people on top, they don't want the general public to be knowledgeable about how the financial system works and really addressing the economic issues and potentially voting in other people. Instead, they're distracting us with a lot of the social issues. And I'm curious, why do you think my generation, the millennials and younger, why do you think we're taking the bait? I mean, everything seems to be about the social issues as opposed to the real problems, the root of it, which is deeper, and really it's connected to who has the money.
Well, societal decay, which is really what you're talking about on the social side, is marching hand in hand with what I would call financial disinformation and criminality. They're inseparable. You don't get one without the other. It's back in the 60s when I was growing up, I remember people saying, don't worry, be happy. If it feels good, do it. Well, we've been doing that for a long time. If it feels good, do it. And be happy, don't worry. That's about to end, but it's only going to end when that locomotive crashes into the ravine. It won't stop before then. And nobody that we elect can stop it right now. It's too big and it's too deeply entrenched. But remember what happened in Sri Lanka when everything collapsed. In the middle of the night, the government got into cars and left. Everybody left. They did everything the EU advised them to do about agriculture and destroyed their economy. And then they drove away because there was nothing left to salvage. Now, I hope it won't be that bad, but I wouldn't be surprised because at some point when things are really bad and you can't cover it up anymore, remember margin call, sell it all before anybody finds out, sell it all before anybody, pass the toxic assets to somebody else. You're not going to be able to do that when this happens.
Right. And what was once the risk-free asset around the world carries a lot of risk, default risk or duration risk with all the inflation. And so things are more precarious than ever. A lot of people feel like they have no choice. You're CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. It seems like we only have, it's left versus right. Everything is you pigeonhole yourself into one of these two camps. But why don't we have more choice? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, first of all, your mainstream media won't support any alternative to the status quo. So they're not going to admit anyone else to the operation. Look what's happened to RFK Jr. The DNC is going to sue the man. I mean, they're doing everything they can to destroy RFK Jr. because he represents an alternative. Now, is it perfect? No, there are no perfect candidates. Do I agree with 100% of any of them? No, but I can agree with 80% in some cases. But the point that you're making is a very valid one. Where do you go? Our Country, Our Choice is there for a few important reasons. Number one, we're Americans. We refuse to be part of this hybridization of America. We believe in the United States of America. We are American citizens. We believe in American identity, culture, language, history. We want to preserve those. We also want to recruit. And I tell people when I speak, you've got to join us. And when this thing collapses, when it implodes, and it's coming, you Americans that are outside of the Beltway, I'm talking about people that didn't go to the Ivy Leagues, that didn't go to the service academies, Americans in Oregon, Americans in Montana, Americans in Texas, people, normal people who just love the country and care about it, who have no special agenda other than their country and saving it. We've got to bring you to Washington and put you into the appointed positions and the elected positions. All of these things have to happen. People kind of look at me and say, geez, that's pretty radical. Well, that's what Andrew Jackson did. And these things have happened before. It's just that we haven't had as bad a situation economically in the past as we have today. But we've got to have people lined up, people that we say, okay, Joe, you live in northern Alabama, and Betty, you're in Montana. You're solid people. We're going to put you into these jobs right now in Washington. We got to do it. And what they have to do is be loyal to the country. First and foremost. First your country, then everything else.
And we need to fix the money. We can't have this monopoly, and we need to stop all the money printing. I'm actually very grateful that we have something like Bitcoin that can provide a peaceful transition so that maybe we can avoid a seismic, just terrible deflationary bust and collapse that would really hurt a lot of people. People can start to slowly allocate to something like Bitcoin. And there's nothing more American, really. I mean, think of the principles that it stands for: freedom, individualism, personal responsibility, self-sovereignty, which is why I'm so passionate about it, and I'm glad you are too. As we start to wrap up, I really hate when the mainstream media does this lazy job of just branding someone a conspiracy theorist because they disagree with the mainstream view, or they say they're an apologist for this person or that person, and they don't examine things with more nuance. And I know that you've faced that, right? You were listed, I think, this week that you're an apologist for Putin, along with this big circle of other media folks. Can you address what you want people to know about that?
Oh, look, I'm an American, and I'm trying to sort, just like every other American, sort truth from fiction. That's the first thing. Trying to understand what's really happening. And when I talk, that's what I try to tell people. I'm trying to convince people that this business with Russia is stupid. It's unnecessary. It's antithetical to our interests. Russia is not the enemy. China, the Chinese aren't coming here. Oh, they're coming here illegally, largely because the Chinese economy is in a lot of trouble, and they're dumping people on us right now because they can't employ them. We're dumb enough to let them in because we can't employ them either in most cases. But we don't have to worry about those things. We're not, on the threshold of Armageddon with anybody except ourselves. We need to understand that the enemy is here. It's us. It's DC. It's the swamp. Now, some people say, well, you Americans are guilty of having allowed this to happen. Well, that's true. But remember, we believed in representative government. We thought if we elected good people, they would go and look after our interests. Boy, were we wrong. And if you read any of the books that are out there about what happens inside the Beltway, there's a gentleman named Buck from Colorado. He's leaving office, but he wrote something that says the swamp is deeper than you think. And he tries to explain how impossible it is to survive in this highly corrupt atmosphere where money determines everything. The only way to stop that is to take away the money. You take away the money through a crisis. And then, yes, of course, Bitcoin is going to roar into common use for the reasons that we've discussed. Will we ever completely eliminate fiat currency? Maybe someday. I don't know. I'm sure something will survive. But for all the reasons that you've mentioned, Bitcoin remains very, very attractive. Just forget all the old guys that stand around and say, well, that's ridiculous. That'll never work. Those are the people governing you right now. They've made a mess of things. I mean, somebody said, well, why would you take someone at the age of 30 and put them into a key position in Washington when they don't have experience and they haven't gone to the best schools and so forth? Said, well, we've had all these people that went to the best schools and theoretically were experienced, and they've made a mess of it. So I think we'll do better with just Americans who care about the country. That's kind of where we are. I don't have any silver bullets to offer. other than to say, get ready for the roller coaster ride. And we're about to go over the top, and we're going to take a deep dive. We're going to come out of it. I'm confident we will prevail. This is going to wake up Americans. And it's going to be up to you, people like you, and a lot of others in your age group who are in their 30s, probably people in their 40s, maybe even some in the 50s. They're going to have to step forward and run the place. I wish I were 20, 30 years older or younger, because if I were, I'd be excited about the opportunity. I know that sounds crazy to a lot of people, but that's the way I feel. Whenever you have these dramatic sea changes in societies, and we're long overdue for this,
Sure.
everything changes. Remember what happened after the Civil War? The biggest scientific industrial expansion in human history. We're still living on the legacy of what happened between 1865 and 1950. It was enormous. I think we'll go through something like that again eventually. It'll be different in character, but it'll be similar. But first, pain. Pain is unavoidable.
You're so right. With every crisis, there is so much opportunity. And I love that with this serious and measured tone, you have a lot of hope under the surface. And I think that's going to be inspiring for a lot of people. All right, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, always such a pleasure. Where can people find your work and learn more about Our Country, Our Choice?
Well, as long as YouTube doesn't ban my work or censor me, you can find a lot of my things on YouTube, but certainly on Rumble. And ourcountryourchoice.com. Just write it as one word, ourcountryourchoice.com. Go there. You can see a lot of material, not just about me, but about all the people that are marching in this direction. We're up to almost 200,000 members now. We're growing very rapidly. It's all a question of people finding out that we're there. And I keep telling people we don't want just another rally. This is not about another rally. This is about preparing for the future. Mobilizing people so that when the time comes, they'll be there to take over and do the job. And I really think we can do that.
All right. And I hope everyone's following you on X. I will link to all of those sources in the show notes. And thank you so much, Colonel.
Thank you, Natalie, for all that you do. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Coin Stories podcast brought to you by Bitdeer. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on any new content. This show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. My inbox is open if you want to share feedback or guest suggestions. You can reach me at Natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. I'll see you next time.